Hello, everybody. I can't say good afternoon, although it is the afternoon here in Hong Kong, scattered as everybody is across several continents. But thank you very much for joining, and a warm welcome to everybody. And it does give me very great pleasure to welcome, in particular, our second keynote speaker, Dr. Henry Jones from the UK. Henry is a lecturer in translation studies at the University of Manchester in the UK. He is a coordinator of the Genealogies of Knowledge research network, and he's also co-editor of the Routledge Encyclopedia of Citizen Media. He's a well-known researcher, well into a number of topics actually, but his research into Wikipedia, that's one of his main focuses, has mainly looked towards highlighting the extent to which translation practices are inextricably bound up with the processes of negotiation through which knowledge is collaboratively produced in this online platform. His other research interests lie in the fields of corpus-based translation studies, translation history, and media theory. And today, his keynote speech is on the subject of corpus-based Wikipedia studies, theoretical and methodological challenges for translation scholars. So would you please welcome him, and thank you very much, Henry. Over to you.
Thanks, Mark, and I'd like to start by just saying a massive thank you to you, Mark, and Esther and everyone on the organising committee for taking the initiative in organising this this conference, even under such difficult circumstances. But it is really exciting to see that a critical mass of scholarship on Wikipedia from a translation studies perspective has now, in a sense, been achieved, in the sense that we can now have a full 3-day conference on the topic of Wikipedia translation. And looking at the program, it looks like there's some really interesting work being done out there. And I do hope that this event really does act as a springboard for much further work in this area. I'm going to share my screen now, so hopefully tell me if you can't see the slides. We did test it and it should work okay. Right, can you see them? Great. So my aim with this talk today is to explore the promise and challenges of corpus-based methodologies for the study of translation in Wikipedia. And really, it derives directly from a series of questions that I've been struggling with for some years now, as I've thought about how to do translation research in the context of Wikipedia. And these are fundamentally the questions of how to deal with the sheer scale of Wikipedia as an encyclopedia, as a data set, how to engage our research in a meaningful way with the fact that the encyclopedia contains over 57 million articles, now written in over 320 different languages. How can we hope to possibly identify the full range and variety and significance of translation practices taking place within such a vast data set? And to a certain extent, I think actually achieving this goal of engaging with this scale of data is, I think this is really an impossible task, unfortunately. But I do think it's fair to say that to date, much research conducted on Wikipedia from a translation studies perspective has tended to focus only on a very restricted number of Wikipedia articles or talk pages. And this is certainly the case in all of the work that I've published on this topic so far. And I'd also suggest that there's quite a number of ways in which we might begin to sort of expand the scope of our analyses, to widen our focus as researchers to encompass a much larger selection of the Wikipedia content available. And I think one of the most promising ways forward in this respect are corpus-based methodologies. So as I'm sure you're very well aware, corpus-based methodologies are essentially involving the construction and computer-assisted analysis of often very large collections of text, often in the millions or if not billions of words, in order to identify and explore recurring patterns in language use. This is the core aim, really. And the methodology typically makes use of tools such as word frequency lists and concordances, which can help us to investigate linguistic patterns which would often be invisible, or at least very difficult to observe in a systematic and efficient manner, with the manual modes of reading, close reading and close analysis that we've more conventionally adopted in our field. As I'm sure you're also very well aware, the use of corpora in the study of translation phenomena has become hugely popular within the wider field of translation interpreting studies, starting in around 1990 with the initial exploratory studies of Mona Baker and colleagues into the distinctive features of translated language in comparison with non-translated language. And then also some research started in the 1990s concerning individual translators' own unique styles. And both these themes of research have continued through to the present day in work, for example, by Kruger and de Sutter, 2018, and Hu, 2016. But more recently, new trends in this area of study have emerged, and corpora have been applied as valuable tools for investigating a whole host of wider translation studies questions, including the ways in which translation has historically been involved in redefining and adapting cultural concepts as they have traveled across languages, time and space. And here I'm thinking particularly of the work that I was privileged to be involved with on the Genealogies of Knowledge project, which ran here at the University of Manchester from 2016 to 2020. But also work, for example, by Ju and Kim, 2019, looking at the Chinese context and the concept of individualism. But as far as I can see, there's been so far no concerted effort to attempt to apply corpus-based methodologies to study translation in Wikipedia. I was very pleased to see that Dr. Jonas Pan's talk on the last day of this conference will also make use of a corpus-based approach to explore public narratives of interpreting disseminated through Wikipedia. But I'm not aware of other scholars working on Wikipedia with this methodologies, and I do hope that together, Dr. Pan and I can inspire others to adopt similar approaches in their own work. To illustrate sort of the potential of this methodology, of this approach for Wikipedia translation studies, as well as some of the challenges that are associated with this method of study, I'm going to use two case studies, each of which seeks to address quite different research questions, but which complement each other quite well, and which highlight different challenges pertaining to this methodology. So the first makes use of a pre-existing sketch engine corpus, the English Wikipedia corpus, and this comprises all of the English language Wikipedia's encyclopedia articles in the state that they were in when the corpus was compiled back in 2014. And the second case study there makes use of a much smaller but custom-made corpus, a thematic corpus of Wikipedia Talk pages. And I'll explain what I mean by a thematic corpus a bit later. And this is a corpus that I've developed as part of an AHRC funded project that I'm currently leading in collaboration with colleagues at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. So in the first case study, I'm primarily interested in the ways in which the figure of the translator is presented across all of the English Wikipedia's several millions of articles. While in the second case study, I want to show how the corpus-based approach can help us to explore the forms and functions of translation talk and other forms of metalinguistic discussion in Wikipedia's backstage discussion spaces. So, case study 1. How is the figure of the translator presented in Wikipedia? I must say that one of the first and most pressing challenges that corpus analysts often encounter in the very early stages of their work is this task of actually creating the corpus itself, this very large collection of texts. If we were working with physical books, as was the case on the Genealogies of Knowledge project, there we were creating large corpora of, for example, 19th century translations of classical Greek and Latin political works. So the corpus compilation process actually involved making scanned copies of the physical books and then using optical character recognition software to convert the images into computer readable text files. And this was a very laborious, very time consuming, very costly process, possible really only with large amounts of funding, time and patience. So we had 4 years for this project. We had nearly £1 million of funding, and we had a whole team of PhD students who were able to help us with all this corpus compilation work. But this isn't, of course, a luxury that most research groups are able to enjoy. In the case of Wikipedia, we are, of course, in a situation which is slightly more straightforward in that the text we are interested in putting in our corpus are already in electronic machine readable form. This is born digital data, so it's already computer readable. And in theory, if we wanted to include a Wikipedia text in our corpus, this could simply involve copying and pasting the content from the web page into a text file for analysis using one of a variety of software packages that are freely available on the internet for download, tools such as AntConc or Wordsmith. But doing this process of copying, pasting manually at the scale of Wikipedia is still going to be an impossibly laborious and time-consuming task. What if we want to conduct an analysis of the use of a particular term in every single one of the English Wikipedia's 6 million or so articles? What if we want, as is the case here, to explore the representation of translators across the whole of the English Wikipedia platform, rather than in just a small selection of its articles? Copying and pasting the contents of each article manually could take many months, possibly even longer, and that's even before we start the analysis itself. Looking out for solutions, we find that Wikipedia does in fact make its contents, its data freely available in what it rather unpoetically terms dumps. So these are downloadable copies of the entire Wikipedia contents released on a monthly basis. But these are huge files, typically many gigabytes of data, and they present Wikipedia only in its very rawest form, unstructured and replete with wiki markup and metadata, as you can see in the screenshot on the right there. So processing these requires substantial computing resources and knowledge also of programming languages such as Python to be able to successfully clean this data for use in a corpus analysis tool. Looking for solutions elsewhere then, we find that in fact pre-existing corpus resources do exist. So other scholars working in other fields have already created Wikipedia corpora for use by the research community. And one such corpus is hosted by Sketch Engine, which is a popular web-based corpus analysis tool. And this is compiled from a Wikipedia dump produced in the second half of September 2014. It's been cleaned of all wiki markup. It's been made much more straightforward to work with. And in fact, it is also possible to access this same corpus via a different site, englishcorpora.org, free of charge if your institution doesn't have a Sketch Engine license. So the corpus contains, well over 1.3 billion words of text, and this comprises around 3.3 million Wikipedia articles, this being essentially the full contents of Wikipedia in the English language version back in September 2014 when this corpus was compiled. The downside of using this corpus is, of course, that this corpus is now well over 7 years old and can no longer really be said to represent Wikipedia's content today. As has been well documented in the literature, Wikipedia is a fluid and constantly changing object of study. And the English Wikipedia has very nearly doubled in size since 2014 in terms of the number of articles and the size of article text recorded. But on the plus side, this corpus is very easy to access and very easy to use. Sketch Engine's interface is very intuitive, very quick to pick up. So bearing this in mind, what kind of research questions might we answer and unlock using this Sketch Engine dataset? So the inspiration for the case study that I'm going to present today is taken largely from a journal article by Lucille Davier in Geneva, who analysed a corpus of Swiss news articles, so not Wikipedia content, but news articles published in French and German. And in analysing these texts, she was interested in finding out which forms of translation are given the highest visibility in news articles generally in the Swiss press, and how is translation and the translation profession conceptualized within news discourse. And as Davier notes, investigating these questions is very important for our field, as it may help social actors such as translators or professional societies fight against existing prejudices about translation. In other words, research of this kind might help us to identify and combat common misperceptions of translation and translators, and thus improve the social status of translators in society. But my case study also finds some inspiration in work by Torres Simon. In 2018, her article demonstrated how the multilingual encyclopedia can be used as a source of big data to find out how members of the general public outside of the profession and outside of academia conceptualize translation and interpreting. But whereas her study, Torres Simon's study, analyzed a single entry, the Wikipedia entry about translation, specifically in 93 different language editions of the encyclopedia, the approach that I'd like to adopt in my case study is somewhat different in that I want to explore how the figure of the translator is presented across all of the content of the entire Wikipedia in its English language version only. So my question is essentially this: what perceptions of translators are being circulated in the English Wikipedia? So, searching the Sketch Engine corpus for the keyword translator and its plural form translators retrieves a concordance of 19,136 hits, indicating that either the singular or plural form of this noun are used over 19,000 times in the English Wikipedia, as it was in 2014. This is a rather large and somewhat cumbersome concordance to deal with. So we can consult the corpus linguistics literature for helpful strategies that can help us to deal with such a large concordance, a large number of search hits for our keyword. And one of the best strategies is using tools such as the collocation tool that's offered by Sketch Engine. So this is a tool which helps us to identify the most significant collocates of our keyword translator and translators. It helps us to find those words that appear with unusually high frequency in close proximity. So I've chosen a window of 3 words either side of the keyword, in close proximity with translator and translators, calculated using a variety of statistical measures which are widely applied in corpus linguistics, but which we don't need to go into too much depth now. For anyone who's interested, this is the list of collocates ranked according to the log dice score, but it's also possible to generate similar lists using, for example, mutual information scores. And when we generate this list using the concordancing tool, we find that the top 20 most statistically significant collocates for translator and translators are poet, FM, essayist, low-power, interpreter, interpreters, writer, low-powered, critic, scholar, novelist, literary, Bible editor, linguist, journalist, fill-in, playwright, prolific, and freelance. The first thing that we might notice about this list is the presence of a number of terms that we wouldn't otherwise have expected to be there. So it's no surprise, I think, to find that in the word interpreter, interpreters are among the top collocates of translator and translators, given the ways in which these two professions have been historically grouped together. But it is somewhat surprising to find terms such as FM, low power, low powered, and fill in this list of statistically significant collocates. These are not what we might have expected to find. And this is really one of the joys of corpus-based approaches, that they bring to light unexpected results, patterns which we might not otherwise have found or even considered interesting. And running new searches, generating new concordances for each of these combinations, so FM translator, low power translator, low powered translator, we find that in many of the Wikipedia articles contained in this corpus, translator actually has another meaning. It refers to a kind of machine, a radio station used to transmit or retransmit the programming of another larger station, a phenomenon which is particularly common, apparently, in the US and Canada due to the large geographical spaces covered. So we read that a broadcast translator is a low-powered FM radio station that retransmits the programming of a parent station that operates on a different frequency. Now, in a sense, we might consider this simply noise in the corpus and discount it from the analysis, considering it irrelevant to our interests and irrelevant to our research question. But looking at this from another perspective, we might well ask, what does this tell us about perceptions of human translators if these subsidiary radio stations also share the name translators? It seems inevitable to my mind that perceptions of one kind of translator will shape perceptions of the other kind. That the shared name helps construct the perception that the activities of both human translators and broadcast translators are essentially the same, or at least in many ways similar. Does this polystemy of the word translator in the Wikipedia corpus perhaps provide further evidence then to support the idea that the role of the human translator is widely seen in general society in almost machine-like terms? The translator's job is to receive communications and then retransmit them for further dissemination. No more, no less. And I think this could certainly be worth much further investigation, and the adoption of corpus-based methods would be an excellent way to approach this research, perhaps continuing with a focus on Wikipedia, or indeed comparing this analysis with other corpora, for example, the British National Corpus. So the other thing that we notice in the list of collocates here is that they almost all pertain to the literary field. So we have poet, essayist, writer, critic, novelist, literary, Bible editor, playwright. So if, as Firth famously suggested, you shall know a word by the company it keeps, these patterns clearly position the translator as another participant within the literary field. And literary translator, as the literary translation is revealed as by far the most visible form of translation activity in Wikipedia, a fact that we'll discuss in much more detail very shortly. So, aside from looking at the most significant collocations of our search term, another strategy for dealing with very large concordances, very large search results, 19,000 plus search hits for our keyword translator. Another strategy is to generate a random sample of lines extracted from the larger concordance. And this is another well-trodden route in corpus linguistics. Random samples can provide us with a much more manageable data set from which to identify the main patterns, and generating further samples can then allow us to test these initial hypotheses to see whether they hold true across further random samples, or whether we need to complicate our understanding of the patterns at work. So Sketch Engine actually makes this process of sampling very straightforward thanks to its random sample button. So the user simply clicks on this, and then they're given the option of choosing how large a sample they would like to generate. And in this case, I just chose 200 lines. And again, when we analyze this smaller sample concordance, we find a number of interesting themes and patterns that recur again and again. For a start, we find that the job title translator very often appears as one entry in a long list of other occupations of biographies of specific individuals. We read, for example, that Michael Hamburger was a noted British translator, poet, critic, memoirist, and academic. We also read that Sugapathala de Silva was an acclaimed Sri Lankan dramatist, novelist, translator, radio play producer, and Sinhala radio play writer. And finally, we read that Alexander Walker was a Scottish physiologist, aesthetician, encyclopedist, translator, novelist, and journalist. So, as Davier also found in her study, this would seem to position translation as a essentially peripheral activity, or at least one of several artistic occupations. As we know, it is certainly a concrete fact that in the field of literary translation, translators only rarely are able to sustain an adequate income to live off the proceeds of their translation work alone. Translation is, for many literary translators, something that they do alongside other better paid work. But this patterning in the concordances also serves to underline the near invisibility in the Wikipedia context of translators who work outside of the literary field. Legal translators, medical translators, technical translators, translators for whom the translation work is their sole source of income and professional employment. That said, there are a number of interesting exceptions to this general rule of invisibility for the non-literary translator. There is mention, for example, of translators working in crisis situations such as Haiti, where translators are listed among other professionals providing humanitarian assistance in the wake of the devastating earthquake. So doctors, medical technicians, translators are sent to Haiti. We also find in another concordance line, this is from an article about the Egyptian novelist Bahar Taher, who notes that this famous author worked for some time as a translator for the United Nations. And finally, we also have a rather negative view of legal translation in the following line. Translation is here being framed as an expense that the people involved in this case, this court case, would rather have avoided. But what's interesting here, I think, is that the non-literary translators are either anonymous, adding further to their peripherality as service providers, or translation work is not seen to constitute a core aspect of their professional identity. So Bahar Taher, in the second example there, is presented first and foremost as an Egyptian novelist and short story writer. The fact that he worked as a non-literary translator for the UN is discussed as just something he did during his career in exile from Egypt. It is interesting to speculate then whether he is not described as an Egyptian novelist, short story writer, and translator, simply because non-literary translation is not an activity with which enough symbolic capital is associated in our culture. Perhaps this has to do with non-literary translation being seen as less creative as a form of translation, and thus less worthy of honor and prestige. Indeed, across the English Wikipedia corpus, we again and again find that while literary translation enjoys some visibility in the biographies of notable figures, the activities of translators working in other genres of text are considerably less prominent. I'm going to leave this case study there because I'm conscious of the time and I want to leave space for the second case study. But I hope you can see from what I presented so far that this English Wikipedia corpus, hosted by Sketch Engine, represents an immensely valuable resource for exploring a number of very pressing research questions relating to perceptions of translation and translators circulating outside of our academic discipline and indeed outside of the language services industry. We could, of course, seek to answer much the same questions by focusing on specific Wikipedia articles associated with specific and necessarily notable translators, in the sense that if they weren't notable, then they wouldn't have a Wikipedia page about them. But the corpus-based methodology allows us to generalize much more widely about the presentation of translators of all kinds, notable or anonymous, literary or non-literary, human or machine. It therefore helps us to engage, I think, much more substantially with the scale of this vast online encyclopedia platform. So I'm going to move on now to the second case study. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this deals with essentially the question of what are the functions of translation talk in Wikipedia. So as I mentioned in my abstract, I've since September this year been working on a new project which is focused on the challenges of translating expert medical knowledge into the Wikipedia space. More specifically, this project aims to explore the translation of medical knowledge in the English and French language Wikipedias, adopting a very broad view of what constitutes medical knowledge to include not only the findings of biomedical science, but also the practices of traditional and alternative systems of healthcare, such as traditional Chinese medicine, Indian Ayurveda, and homeopathy. Indeed, I'm particularly interested in investigating the interactions and negotiations that take place in Wikipedia between proponents of these competing medical epistemologies. and the ways in which language is used to establish, maintain, and contest the divisions and distinctions between valid medical knowledge, quackery, conspiracy theory, and bad science. And to achieve this aim, we adopt a corpus-based methodology in order to examine knowledge translation practices taking place not simply within a handful of articles, Wikipedia articles, but also across a broad selection of Wikipedia's medicine and health-related content. Clearly, however, existing resources such as the Sketch Engine English Wikipedia corpus that are used in the first case study would not be adequate here. The Sketch Engine interface provides no means of selecting a subcorpus of only those Wikipedia articles that deal with medical and health-related topics. It also omits from its collection of Wikipedia content any of the associated talk pages, which, as research has already extensively shown, are often important sites for the negotiation of knowledge between the diverse members of this Wikipedia community. The Sketch Engine corpus only allows access to the main space of Wikipedia, its encyclopedia articles. And remember, they are only in the form that they were in back in September 2014, so 7 years ago. So, although considerably smaller in size at just 1.6 and a bit million words, the corpus we've constructed here for this project represents a much more powerful resource for the research questions that I'm interested in. It's a thematic corpus, meaning it only contains articles which are being categorized by the Wikipedia community as medicine related. It also includes the contents of all the talk pages associated with these medicine related Wikipedia articles. And finally, it's substantially richer in metadata in comparison with the Sketch Engine resources. And this essentially means that it's possible to make further subcorpus selections, only looking at articles associated with Chinese medicine or Western medical science or homeopathy, for example. In future iterations of this corpus, or if assuming everything goes well with the project, we hope to make it possible to access and analyze some of the revision history of these texts as well, allowing the user to conduct diachronic analyses of how Wikipedia's medical content has changed over time, partly in line with changes in the demography of its community, as well as in line with changes in policies and other factors outside of Wikipedia. This feature, this diachronic feature, is not yet ready, but we hope it might be possible to get this up and running by next summer. And we also plan to make this corpus much more widely available to the research community as a whole, once we're sure it's working correctly. So please do stay in touch with me if you are interested in perhaps using or exploring this corpus in the future. I've only been working on this project since September, and I've only really just started the analysis of the corpus. So what I'm presenting here is just one of a series of analyses that I'm planning with the project. But essentially, it focuses on exploring the features and functions within the Wikipedia community of what I'm calling translation talk, following the recent use of this term in research published by Sonia Pritzker. According to Pritzker, translation talk is any instance of metalinguistic discussion about the processes and products of translation. In Pritzker's work, for example, we're presented with numerous instances of translation talk that she has observed between American students of Chinese traditional medicine. Pritzker used an ethnographic approach, and she used this to examine cases where students enrolled on courses in studying traditional Chinese medicine. And we had students discussing specialized TCM terms such as qi and trying to figure out amongst themselves which translations are better or more accurate or even easier to understand, as they learned about these healthcare practices. Questions they consider include, for example, should we understand qi as air, breath, vital force, material energy, or perhaps energy flow? In what context are these different possible solutions more or less appropriate? Such questions, Pritzker finds, are a part of everyday interaction within this school. So, expanding on this previous research and my own preliminary investigations of the corpus, I hypothesized that we may find ample evidence of translation talk also taking place in the English Wikipedia, and particularly in the talk pages associated with those areas of knowledge like traditional Chinese medicine that originate outside of the English-speaking world. Also drawing on this previous research, I hypothesized that much more beyond just translation is accomplished in the interactions, in the translation talk. Wikipedia contributors engage in metalinguistic discussions for a variety of reasons, and these interjections and conversations fulfill a variety of communicative and performative functions that we'll explore shortly within the community. So my research questions are then, what functions does translation talk serve? And what can this analysis tell us about the role of translation in the construction and maintenance of Wikipedia and its community? To answer these questions, I used two keyword searches mainly. The first is mean with an asterisk afterwards, which captures all the word forms starting with M-E-A-N. So mean means meant and meaning. And I also searched for translat with an asterisk, which similarly captures all word forms starting with trans, T-R-A-N-S-L-A-T. So translate, translates, translating, translated, translator, translators. And these initial searches also help prompt further keyword searches, especially for particularly troublesome medical concepts, such as qi, gua sha, dosha, and others. Searching for all of these keywords helped me to quickly and efficiently identify relevant examples of translation talk from across the corpus. These examples could then be explored collectively in the concordances or individually, either within the corpus analysis tool or using the metadata embedded in the corpus texts to refine our selection to examine specific aspects of the corpus only. Alternatively, the corpus maintains a strong link with the Wikipedia platform itself, and as such, it's possible to navigate back to more detailed and contextualized investigation of specific passages of Wikipedia articles or discussion pages on the internet itself again. So it's possible to flick between these wide-angle concordance analyses to close reading of specific passages of specific Wikipedia pages. So what are the, this is the screenshot of showing the subcorpus selection interface, and also the full view, the possibility of identifying particular instances in their context of origin. So what are the functions of translation talk in Wikipedia? As with all talk page discussion in Wikipedia, translation talk serves a variety of functions within the community and often simultaneously. Some of these functions are quite straightforward. First and foremost, participants frequently talk about translation in the talk pages in order to justify a particular edit to a particular article page. And this happens most commonly when they identify what they perceive to be an inaccuracy in the way in which a particular concept has been translated by previous contributors. In the following example, for instance, this IP editor believes that the Chinese concept of qi has been misrepresented as equivalent to vital energy in English. And by highlighting this on the talk page, they seek to justify their deletion of the problematic sentence. Wikipedia, as we know, is an intensely collaborative project, and explaining actions like this is a normal and necessary part of the process of collaboration. Elsewhere, however, participants talk about translation in the talk pages in order to share their personal understanding of a particular concept as part of broader, longer-running discussions of a topic or area of knowledge. In other words, Wikipedians don't talk about translation simply with reference to a particular edit, to a particular revision that they've made or that they want to make in the encyclopedia itself. Instead, they talk about translation as part of the collaborative process of making sense of a topic, especially if that topic relates to a concept that originates outside of the English-speaking world and which they're struggling to make sense of. So my corpus searches reveal, for instance, that the talk page associated with the Chinese traditional medicine practice of gua sha contains extended sections of translation talk as contributors discuss and attempt to negotiate conflicting information about the meaning of the characters which form its name. In the following example, the conversation is led by an Australian contributor who clearly has a strong understanding of Chinese language and medicine. They explain that the character sha cannot in this case be translated as sand, as another user had previously suggested, but as sickness. They also indicate that gua means scrape for. They explain that gua sha is then to scrape for fever. Then, an IP editor adds a note clarifying that gua does not mean to scrape for, but instead to scrape away. Next, the contributor who had initially translated sha as sand comes back in to explain why they chose this translation. They were guided to this solution by a textbook that they had read on traditional Chinese medicine. But they acknowledged the lack of standardization of translations of TCM concepts in English and the challenges that this lack of standardization poses for Wikipedia. A final IP contributor then adds further nuance to the collective understanding of these terms, noting how sha means an unseen illness, and they even suggest ether as another possible translation. They also try to provide some explanation as to why some might understand sha to mean sand, suggesting this may have something to do with the dialect spoken. The end result of all this translation talk is a series of edits to the main article page, in which these possible translations of Chinese characters are documented. Translation talk can thus be seen to form an essential part of the process of discussion and exchange through which Wikipedians seek to improve the accuracy and comprehensiveness of their encyclopedia. And the corpus-based methodology makes identifying such examples much more straightforward than manually reading through pages and pages of Wikipedia's talk page discussion forums. As you can see, the richness of the metadata in the corpus means that we can easily trace individual concordance lines back to the Wikipedia platform itself and the original context from which they have been extracted. Interestingly, though, translation talk not only serves communicative functions, but also performative ones within the Wikipedia community. And it's at this point that it's helpful to think about concepts drawn from Austin's speech act theory. In his research, Austin introduced the idea of speech acts as utterances that perform actions. using examples such as the wedding ceremony, where the words spoken by the official conducting the ceremony perform the action of the couple, of making the couple married. But as Austin later showed, even an utterance that may appear simply declarative in form, such as, for example, making a statement that a particular Chinese traditional medicine concept can be translated into English in a particular way, even this may be considered to have a performative function at the same time. It may often be the case that its illocutionary force, the action intended by the speaker or discussion forum participant when making that statement, even this illocutionary force may be of greater significance in the communicative context than its basic semantic meaning, its locutionary force. So when we look at the illocutionary force of translation talk in the Wikipedia corpus, we find that contributors often appear to talk about translation problems in order to position themselves as experts whose voice is uniquely worth listening to in discussions of certain topics. In the following example, for instance, a contributor seeks to make clear their expertise by highlighting their own understandings of the underpinnings of Chinese medicine and basing this fundamentally on their understanding of the Chinese language. In other words, by talking about the translation of the Chinese concept of Jingmai, this contributor seeks to highlight their deep linguistic knowledge and to signal this as an important aspect of the domain-specific knowledge required to accurately and authoritatively write about this topic in Wikipedia. This comment is also interesting, I think, because of the way that the contributor further bolsters this claim to expertise through reference to having read the work of the foremost sinologists. It's almost as if familiarity with the specialized translation knowledge published by these external authorities is clearly meant to imply the depth of the contributor's own understanding of this topic. This performative use of translation talk turns out to be quite a common tactic among Wikipedians. And as we see again in the next example, here the contributor writes at length about how much they know about the Chinese language and the best way of rendering a constellation of related concepts in English. And they appear to do this not in response to any specific question or debate, but rather simply as a means of promoting themselves as an important and valuable member of the community. One final example, and this one not taken from a talk page related to a topic within traditional Chinese medicine, but instead to the yogic practice of pranayama. So this example is interesting because it makes clear that the function of translation talk is often to signal domain-specific expertise. And this is often especially important when contributors are attempting to establish or defend their authority and their right to participate in creating the Wikipedia article on a particular topic. By signaling through their translation talk their profound familiarity with the source culture and source language, they are able to indicate that they have more direct access to the original body of knowledge on which the article is based than any of their monolingual peers. In the example, the contributor castigates fellow Wikipedians for not being sufficiently familiar with the source culture and source language from which the practice of breathwork emerged. And as such, they do not recognize this concept of breathwork as a translation of the yoga concept of pranayama. The contributor argues that this translation knowledge is essential for being truly qualified to write an article on breathwork. So once again, then, this case study illustrates how the compilation and computer-assisted analysis of large corpora of Wikipedia data can open up otherwise inaccessible avenues for research in our field. It can make possible the efficient and systematic identification and investigation of patterns and discourses that exist within collections of many hundreds of Wikipedia texts. And indeed, as I've tried to show with the case study, the second case study in particular, the corpus-based approach has allowed us to observe that translation talk is prevalent in English Wikipedia talk pages, especially when these are associated with knowledge originating outside of the English-speaking world. Translation talk can take a number of forms and serve a variety of functions. Much more than translation is achieved in these metalinguistic discussions and interactions. Translation talk also serves as a means of signaling domain-specific expertise within the community. And as I hope I've demonstrated with this second case study in particular, the focus of research using corpora needn't restrict itself exclusively to the perusal and analysis of concordances and word frequency lists. The approach I'm advocating here is only corpus-based, in the sense that it begins with the analysis of the corpus. It is not entirely corpus-driven. If the design of the corpus and associated software permits, I would suggest that a productive approach when exploring Wikipedia is for users to switch fluidly back and forth from comprehensive wide-angle concordances to narrow, close readings of particular pages, or even particular discussion threads within specific talk pages. This approach, at least, has been very productive already in my own research in this field, and I hope very much that it can inspire other studies using similar methodologies in the future. That's everything I have prepared for this morning. Thank you again very much for listening, and I look forward very much to hearing any comments or questions that you might have. Thank you.
So thank you very much indeed, Henry, for that really fascinating, wide-ranging presentation of the different, well, I mean, you presented two different research projects and many different ramifications leading from them. So we have a good few minutes now to ask Henry any questions you might have, or indeed to come back with comments, observations. I can see 3 hands straight away. Clara, would you like to kick off? Let me, okay, you have unmuted yourself, perfect. Do go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much, Henry, and also very nice to see you again. Virtually, yes. It was really very interesting and informative talk. And I have 2 questions, if I may. The first one is about research methods, because this morning, or small hours for you, when Julie gave the first keynote, it was also about using digital methods, the methods to collect the quantitative data, for example, the corpus methods. And in your talk, you did mention one of the studies that you mentioned used ethnography, and also later on you said after having collected the large quantitative data, you also applied like the narrow reading, the close reading. So my first question is if you may introduce more the use of the methods to collect both the quantitative data and then how to proceed with that, or in parallel to use qualitative methods or the methods to analyze or to collect qualitative data. That's the first question. And the second one is that you mentioned the knowledge that originates outside of the English-speaking world. And I was really fascinated when you gave the example of the Chinese traditional medicine. So the examples that you gave, for example, the talk pages, the interactions are all in English. So I wonder if you may talk more on like how you collect the data, if they are presented in non-English languages, for example, and also the interactions between Wikipedians or other participants in the digital world, like they communicate in non-English languages, because after all, it's the knowledge that originates outside of the non-English, outside of English speaking world. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Clara, and yeah, hello again. Yeah, I think so. The first question is about the sort of use of quantitative and qualitative modes of analysis within the framework of corpus-based methodologies, I guess. And I think this is one of the most interesting things about the corpus-based approach, is that it allows for a very flexible integration of both quantitative and qualitative methods. Many corpus-based studies of within translation studies and in the wider field of corpus linguistics are heavily statistical and mainly quantitative in nature. But I think the approach that I've always adopted in my own use of this methodology has been primarily qualitative, using the quantitative statistical information, such as the list of collocates that I presented in the first case study, using that really only as a point of departure, a sort of a way into the data, as a way of highlighting patterns and aspects of this collection of texts that I wouldn't otherwise have paid attention to, and then using the other tools that these interfaces, these corpus analysis tools offer, to then look more qualitatively at the language being used and patterns in that language use. So yeah, in other scholars might use corpus-based methodologies in quite different ways, and I think you know, it's a broad church. There's room for lots of approaches. But yeah, in that's how I understand the relation between these two approaches. The second question, from what I've seen so far, all of it's very rare to find non-English language discussion in English language, in the English language Wikipedia talk pages.
Yeah.
Which is interesting in itself when you think about it. But I guess that's just become a community norm, that when you're talking about how to write the English language Wikipedia, you conduct those discussions also in English. And of course, many of the people are not native English speakers, and in fact, they might feel it. Yeah, you can tell that they're struggling to communicate their ideas in English, but they do tend to talk in English. Sorry, go on.
No, I just find that's very interesting, because, you know, when I studied those online translation communities and looking at their interactions between the participants, there is more code switching, and
right.
Yeah, and also as the researcher, when we write it up or to tidy up the data, we need to to translate it into Chinese in my case, then back translate the English into Chinese. So I wonder if what's the situation is like in your case. So
yeah, I think that they're making reference to these concepts that originate outside of the English speaking world, like qi and guasha, but it's sort of just these concepts. They're not. It's not code switching in the full sense, really. They're trying to make sense of these concepts together. Yeah,
maybe I will email you too.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And can we turn now to Janice, if you'd like to ask your question?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Henry. This is
Hello.
a very interesting talk, and I would like to first of all echo your feeling of choosing the data, especially the example that you provided, FM and the translation. I encountered exactly the same issue when I was
Yeah.
when I was approaching my data. So, for example, the first item, if you search interpreting, then it would be interpretation from a computer program, which is very similar to your case. So I strongly echo your feeling, the kind of dilemma that you faced, whether or not to include such kind of data. My question is relevant to the second case study that you mentioned. You talked about the collection of the medical articles for the corpus that you employed, which is an amazing job, I believe. But if you can, could you please tell us a little more detail on the selection criteria? So how the articles are selected, and what kind of metadata we should, for future research as well. So what kind of metadata we should include when we collect such kind of corpus for ourselves? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a really interesting one, and I glossed over it, but actually it was a lot more complicated than it might seem. So the idea was to use Wikipedia's own categorization, so community-led categorization of Wikipedia articles. So for example, there is a category medicine-related articles, and there's also category alternative medicine. And so we used those as our starting points. But then when you dig a bit deeper, you find that they're not the only ways in which Wikipedians categorize topics. So there's that system, but there's also these info boxes on the right-hand side of many Wikipedia pages. And for example, if you go to the Wikipedia article about alternative medicine, it's got one of these info boxes, and then it's got a list of other related articles. I think it phrases it something like that. And it's a very long list of actually quite a different selection to the articles that are included in the category Wikipedia Alt Medicine. So that then poses a dilemma: which system do you use? And we're actually exploring at the moment. I don't know whether we're actually managed to get this far in the current project, but we're exploring sort of machine learning approaches to corpus selection. So this would be where you identify a core selection of Wikipedia articles which are definitely on the topics that you're interested in, so medical related topic. The machine then analyzes the words that are most frequently appearing in those articles, and then looks throughout the rest of the Wikipedia encyclopedia for other articles that have a similar frequency and similar patterns of language use, no matter whether they're included in the sort of community categories or not. And this is a way of getting around the fact that the Wikipedia's categorization, community-led categorization, is so sort of unreliable as a corpus selection method, because it seems to miss out certain things just haphazardly. So at the moment we have followed the community-led categorization, but I think there's more that could be done to improve this, perhaps using these machine learning approaches. We'll see. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if, I mean, of course, for medical texts, it may be easier to decide, but if there are cases like the previous one, like there are certain kind of dilemma that you are faced, you face up with, and then you need to make a choice whether or not to include that piece of article, what kind of criteria would be there to guide the selection?
Yeah, it is a difficult one. And I think ultimately you just have to make a choice and then document it for other users of the corpus. I think, yeah. I think with medical related topics, it is perhaps a bit more straightforward than in other areas, but essentially we've taken the decision so far just to use the community-led categorization, which does make it a bit more clear-cut, even if it's not fully comprehensive as a way of selecting articles. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have two more questions, I think, I'd like to squeeze in. First of all, Khaled, who has been waiting patiently for quite some time, and then we also have one question in the chat I'd like to include if possible. So Khaled, please do go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Henry, for that wonderful really presentation today. I'm happy that I meet you online after like a few years that we met in Hong Kong, last time face to face. Yeah, it's interesting actually, but let me start with a quick techie question. I mean, that when you downloaded the talk pages, I mean, like you're making the corpora, I guess you're using the tools that's available on Wikipedia, right? I mean, that the download.
The special export, yeah.
Do you need to clean that? I mean, is there any way that quick you can clean those texts from the coded language, or just use it as is? I mean, that's one thing, I mean, for you analyze.
Yeah, you need to clean it, and that's why I'm working on this project in collaboration with two computer scientists who are very much more familiar with.
Or just manually you do it? I mean, like my researchers and.
So what you do is there's a export function of Wikipedia, so you can put in any number of URLs into the box, and then it downloads a zip folder with all of the raw Wikipedia pages, but they're again replete with all the wiki markup, and they're not suitable for corpus analysis because they've got all this sort of formatting information in that we're not actually interested in. It's not sort of linguistic information, as it were. So that's where the computer scientists were able to run. But they developed a script using Python, which then can clean up those files to get rid of all the wiki markup and just leave with plain text. But it also extracts things like the page title, the last date of revision, like key elements of the metadata, which will become more and more important if we get around to developing this diachronic version of the corpus, where you can access the revision history and that sort of thing as well within the concordancer. So yeah, it's quite a technical process, and one that I can't claim to understand. That's really fine. Because they've dealt with that.
Very quick, yeah, thanks. A very quick comment related to Clara, actually, a question about the non-English, talk pages. I noticed when I analyzed the crisis in Yemen and how the crisis in Yemen is expressed in Wikipedia, and I noticed that there are differences in terms of the amount of talks we have in the talk pages. I mean, between those talking on the English version of Wikipedia and those talking on the Arabic version of Wikipedia of the same article. And we found probably, there are other factors involved here, like probably social factors, behavior factors, and other things. Because we noticed even the topic is about Yemen, we expect that more talks will be in Arabic, in the Arabic article. But interestingly, we found, no, there are more talks on the English version of it. And the people who are speaking there, we found them actually speakers of Arabic, talking in English, on the Arabic, on the English version.
On the English version.
Few comments, talks in the discussion page, which I think raises many questions for researchers here anyway, but just that's a comment, a quick comment. I know Mark just wanted to, that's enough. Yeah, thank you very much for that. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kenneth.
Thank you. So we have, as I said, one question via the chat from Edward Jacob. I'll just read that out. Thanks very much for this interesting talk and direction for research. What is the top 10 of the most puzzling words in Chinese that complicate your research?
Well, I must admit, I don't have any Chinese, or very little. So what I know about these challenges comes just from reading the talk pages. But so far it seems that qi seems to, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, qi seems to be by far the most troubling concept, that there's the most amount of discussion relating to this, how to express this in English, whether it really can be translated, these issues. Things like, I think it's Jingmai, again, excuse my pronunciation, which is often translated in English language texts as meridians, I believe. And it seems that this is actually quite a controversial translation, because some scholars of traditional Chinese medicine would suggest this sort of misrepresents the fundamental ideas underlying this understanding of the human body. But yeah, I'm afraid I can't elaborate a full top 10. I think those are the main two, based on what I've read so far. Yeah, thanks for the question though.
Well, that's great, and thank you once again, Henry, for really raising so many fascinating issues and pointing out, directions for research and possibilities for the use of corpora. And thank you to everyone who's asked a question. Thank you for taking it further in that way. Now I'm just going to click on the clap button. I invite everybody else to do so. If you can find it, it's under the reactions.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. No, thank you very much. And that brings things to a close for today. If that works, the concept of today and drawing to the end of it works for you, wherever you are. We will be reconvening for what in Hong Kong will be day 2 at 9 a.m. Hong Kong time for the next individual paper session. So I do look forward to seeing as many of you there as possible. And in the meantime, as you will have seen, I think on the website, we're making all of the sessions available on the Baptist University Moodle. You should have the link to that. And Esther and her colleagues have been working very hard throughout the day. And she just asked me to announce that the first keynote and also session 1 are already available. If you missed those, or indeed if you want to go over them again, then they're now available to view. But that winds up everything, I think. Anything else I need to say, Esther, or anybody? If not, let me just have a quick check on the chat. No, there's nothing else. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attendance, your participation. I look forward to seeing many of you for the ensuing sessions. And once again, thank you, Henry. And I look forward to seeing you later on the conference too.